Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
Welcome to a special podcast-only edition of PA Books. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books is a weekly program featuring interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania history, sports, politics, culture, and more. To learn more, visit pcntv.com. In this episode, I'm joined by Robert Swift. He is the author of the book By Great Rivers, Lives on the Appalachian Frontier. Thank you for being with me.
Thanks, Phil.
Now, you write in the book that you wrote a paper as a high school junior on Fort Little Niagara.
Yes.
What was Fort Little Niagara? What was it that drew you to that topic?
The thing that drew me was that there was a remnant of that fort, what they call the Old Stone Chimney, which was the chimney of what was a fort. And then when the fort was burned down, it survived as in houses that lasted. It was part of a trading post and then a house. So it survived the ravages of time. And when I was, you're talking here in junior high school, you can, to this day, it's been moved around several times, but you can still go visit the chimney. And that intrigued me. I think it was considered to be outside of Fort Niagara itself, the oldest structure on the Niagara Frontier, Western New York, where I grew up. And so that's a paper that I remember going down to the Erie County Historical Society and doing research in these musty old books on that. So that intrigued me. And so I made sure that I've always included that when I write about this period. It's like going back to the roots, so to speak, for me.
Now, the book covers biographies, profiles of a lot of individuals who were on the Pennsylvania frontier. How did you decide who to include?
I was looking for, first of all, I wanted people who I was interested in. And some of the people, like the John Kerr brothers, who built Fort Little Niagara, Mary Jameson, a white woman who was taken captive by Seneca, had a long life. Living in the Genesee country. She actually was captured on the Pennsylvania frontier. So I included people I was long interested in, that I felt was interesting. Plus, I wanted to show that the frontier was what I looked at as a multicultural place. It was not just the English on the frontier. You had the French were striving for control of much of this area. You had the Native American tribes, multi-ethnic tribes, really. Delaware, Seneca, Shawnee. You had 1/3 of Pennsylvania spoke German at this time. And you had Moravian missionaries speaking German. You had French Protestants who had fled France. They were, because of the Catholic wars, they were some of the key fur traders. So you had this sort of dynamic society changing as the frontier moved westward. And the two wars of the 18th century, what they call the French and Indian War and the Revolution, sort of broke up that multicultural society. And I had often wondered, if the wars hadn't taken place, would Pennsylvania look much different demographically? Well, we might still have a large Native American population here.
Now, your book does include profiles of a variety of Native American figures, but you also say that we only hear their voices as recorded through white interpreters. Why was that the limitation?
They basically, in this period, didn't have a written language. The Native American tribes, they had an oral tradition where, or if they did, they would like one tribe, the Conestoga, had preserved treaties handed them by William Penn when he visited them in 1701, and they would always bring out the treaties, but there was an oral tradition. So when you're trying to go back into the archives, whether it's the Pennsylvania provincial minutes recorded of meetings, or many of the people who wrote about this period, the literate people, were missionaries so you're relying on them a lot, or interpreters at press conference or the diplomatic conferences. You're relying on their interpretations, what they wrote down, and so I always want to be careful that when I'm describing that, and I want the Native Americans in the book, but I want to be careful that we're looking at someone's perception, and it's really just really hard. Their biographies are fragmentary of their lives. You often don't know when they were born or when they died. So it's difficult. I just want to always make that point that we're looking at like another culture's perspective on them.
Now you mentioned Conestoga, and it's a reference to a people, but it was also a town.
Yes, and it still is. You can go. It's quite the place to visit today. It's in Lancaster County. It's about a mile or two east of the Susquehanna River on a hillside, and there's a state historical marker near it. There actually were two towns there. There was a 1701 village where William, and I think people aren't aware that William Penn actually got out that far to the Susquehanna River and met with them. He was only in Pennsylvania for about 4 years, two separate periods about 20 years apart, but he did get that far. And at that time, for 20 years after, the Conestoga Village, which by this point was a multi-ethnic place where different tribes were living, was the major diplomatic place where the Pennsylvania provincial leaders of the time, William Penn and his successors, Governor Keith and James Logan, they would go out there to hammer out many of the diplomatic treaties that were needed.
Now, one of the key figures in Conestoga was Civility. Who was he?
Yes, and he was, once again, he's something he shows up in the what they call the colonial records of Pennsylvania, and so he, over a period of 20 years, you see his name, and Civility was an English name. He also had a Native American name with various spellings of this. This is a time when people spelled phonetically, and so you can find several versions of his name spelled in the minutes. So he was someone who was trying to all these Native American figures, they're fighting a rearguard action. They're basically being pushed further and further west. Their idea of land conflicted with the English settlers' land. When they sold land, they didn't think of it as, oh, we're going to fence it off and you can't go pass through here to hunt. To them, it was a different idea of land ownership than what the English settlers had. So invariably, when the settlers started moving near Conestoga, you would have problems with, if runaway pigs were in the frontier and they were killed by one of the Indians, there'd be disputes, or whose justice should be used to resolve disputes. Was it the English court system, or the native tradition where maybe the two families in the heart of a dispute sort of reconcile with each other? And Civility was caught up in that sort of negotiation with the provincial Pennsylvania governors coming out to Conestoga.
Now, you mentioned Conestoga as a center of frontier diplomacy, and that's certainly between the English in the east and the Native Americans in the western part, but it was also north and south. You had Iroquois in the north and other groups in Virginia, and there was something called the Warrior's Path. What was that?
Right. The Warrior's Path, and there were a couple of different, this was basically a couple of different, versions of it. It was the north-south path, one, basically going through central Pennsylvania. And at this point, the Iroquois Confederacy, based in Western New York, was the strongest of the Native American tribes. And they were, hostile with the Catawba and Cherokee tribes down basically in South Carolina, that area. And so that Warrior's Path got its name because they would travel up and down the paths engaging in warfare. And the concern was always that this could very easily, draw in Pennsylvania into the conflict, Virginia, Maryland. And that's why there was all this diplomacy to try to resolve, who was going to use what sections of the path. This kind of threat of warfare was really lasted for about 20 years on the between these north-south tribes. And another thing that Pennsylvania had done in the 1730s, Pennsylvania basically struck an alliance with the Iroquois. And people, the Iroquois' capital was at Onondaga, which is modern Syracuse, New York. And so one of the most important paths between the two was called the Tupelhocken Path. And basically that was coming down from Williamsport to Sunbury, then veering eastward, basically through Reading down to Philadelphia. And the idea today that there'd be some connection between Philadelphia and Syracuse, New York, people would never be shaking their heads like, what? But that was one of the more important routes for people because of that alliance that Pennsylvania had built with the Iroquois.
How did that alliance affect the peoples living in Conestoga?
They were basically that superseded their influence was waning in Conestoga because at the start they had been closer. We did have some Swedish and Dutch colonies or Swedish colonies in Pennsylvania, and they had gone fur trading and struck. There were paths that went out to Conestoga. You're even talking the late 17th century, but the fur trade was moving west, and as that did, then that was a lot of the economic interest of the Pennsylvania officials was getting control of the fur trade, and same with the French. As that moved west to the Allegheny region, Ohio, Conestoga became marginalized, and then once Pennsylvania had struck the alliance with the Iroquois, the Conestoga they weren't necessary anymore. And also the other thing was that Pennsylvania had also struck the alliance with the Iroquois because that kept some of the other tribes, the Delaware, who were in the Lehigh Valley, Wyoming Valley area, that they were somewhat, subservience a weird word to use, but the Iroquois had a lot of influence over what they did because they were the stronger power. And Pennsylvania, when they formed that alliance with the Iroquois, it was to help keep those tribes, the Delaware, in check. And of course, the Delaware were a tribe that these tribes are all being, in this period, displaced. White settlement was, Penn was buying land from them, William Penn, and they was pushing them all to the west. So by maybe the 1740s, the Indian villages that were cropping up to the west, we talked about Shamokin, even some of the ones in the Allegheny area, were collections of different tribes living there. They were no longer just one tribe. These villages were polyglot places.
So as Conestoga was superseded, what happened to the people there?
This is a tragic tale, one of the tragic tales. Basically, there were always Indian living, even, Penn would buy land on paper, and he found Lancaster as a city, but didn't mean that Native Americans went away. In fact, they never went away. So there was still a remnant group living at Conestoga, and they earned their living sometimes selling brooms and stuff to the white settlers. It wasn't a prosperous life, but they held by until Pontiac's War in 1763, and that was a war where tribes, from the Great Lakes were coming into Pennsylvania, and the colonial settlers, the Pennsylvanians on the frontier, by this point they had seen many of their families, killed in these raids, and they were no longer tolerant of any Indian groups living with them. So a group called the Paxton Boys, which are really a bunch of border ruffians from this area here, Paxton, Harrisburg, went and massacred them. They massacred them. A few of the survivors were taken to lodge in Lancaster County Jail, and they got broken there and killed them. And when they went to the ruins of the site of the Conestoga town, one of the things they found was the 1701 treaty with William Penn, the parchment. So it's one of the tragic episodes of Pennsylvania history.
Now, you'd mentioned that this frontier area was a multicultural society, and one of the figures that you write about is Anne Latorte, and she was a French person. She was from France. Yeah. How did she end up living in an English colony?
The French basically, in her case, her and her husband Jacques had, come over from France and to England, and then they basically were settling here and get involved in the fur trade. Her son James went on to become a fur trader. Some of the other, there were in time there was a group of these fur traders, French, Pierre Martin Cherté and his son Peter, Bazillion. I'm trying to remember his first name now. Peter Bazillion, another French fur trader. In the case of Cherté and Bazillion, they had actually been, they'd come down from Canada. They'd been on expeditions with LaSalle down in the Mississippi. And then they worked their way east and then got involved in the fur trade here. Anne Latour was more coming from France to London and then over to Pennsylvania. And she was based in the Schuylkill River area, and then they had a trading post not too far from Conestoga. And her son, James Latour, gave the namesake for Latour Run in Carlisle, because he actually went to Carlisle. And he's another one. He kept on moving west. He was one of those ones who moved into the Ohio country as the fur trade went there.
Now, one of the figures you write about is a Native American named Moses Tunda Tatami.
Yeah.
And you say that he was one of the few Native Americans to own land privately within the colony. Why was that unusual?
Basically, there were not many, one with the different concepts of land. Also, he was in one of the few in a special position. He was an interpreter, a negotiator, and so he was able to get some title to some land in what's now called Forks Township, Pennsylvania. And he also had enough skill to go down when the Penn's sons were making land purchases in that area. He had been able to negotiate to continue to live in that area, saying that he had converted to Christianity. And he had actually become a convert of a noted missionary called David Brainerd. So he possessed skill of being able to deal with the Pennsylvania officials, and that's how he was able to get the land.
Now, in addition to Conestoga, one of the other main Native American towns on the frontier was Shamokin. What was significant about that town?
Once again, one of the things when I started looking at this period, I realized that a lot of the state boundaries we're familiar with weren't there, and this region was governed by waterways. And so when you had the forks of a river, that was a strategic spot. So Shamokin was at the forks of the Susquehanna River, modern day Sunbury. Easton, forks of the Delaware. Pittsburgh, forks of the Ohio. Then the other great fork river was the Muskegon River in Ohio, which is Coshocton, Ohio today. So that's where the Native American trails all Shamokin was the juncture of about 5 major east, west, north, south Indian paths. Shamokin was also a town of displaced people. It grew up in the 1730s as different tribes were being pushed out of eastern Pennsylvania. Also, that's where the Iroquois sent their sort of, I've heard some people call him Shikellamy, a viceroy. That's a little bit, I think that's off. It wasn't the Roman Empire here. But he was sort of sent down to keep an eye on the different tribes that were in the Wyoming Valley and sort of being displaced in the upper Susquehanna. He was like the Iroquois' agent there. So that was where he was located. And the Pennsylvania negotiator, Conrad Weiser, that's where the Tupelhocken path would go to. And towards the end of its, there are many accounts the Moravian church sent missionaries, and they had actually had a blacksmith shop there. But there were accounts near the end in the 1750s of riotous times at Shamokin, too much drinking, that sort of thing. So it also had a bad reputation too.
You mentioned the Moravians. Who were they?
They were a German sect, basically based in Bohemia, and they obviously came up out of the 30 Years' War, the Protestant Reformation. They basically are called Pietist sect. But they had a mission here, and they founded the city of Bethlehem, which was basically a church commune until the 19th century. But they had a mission to Christianize uh, Native Americans in their region, and you can argue whether this was a good or bad thing. They the missionaries would go and they were creating these actual European style villages with houses, and they featured a lot of worship. They had what they call love fest with chocolate, milk, and butter, and I always wonder about that. And they were off, but they also would try to preserve the language, the Mohican language, the Delaware. They would write glossaries of that language. So they weren't all. It was they weren't trying to stamp out the whole identity of Delaware, but they were trying to sort of put them in this European style town. Now, and you can argue today whether that was good or bad. And they had a number of these towns throughout, especially throughout eastern Pennsylvania. Then later, they were moving west too with the converts. But Shamokin was a place where they had had a lot of hopes of making inroads with the Native Americans, and this experiment with the Moravians also was sort of like took a heavy hit with both the French and Indian War and the Revolution.
Now, another major figure during this time was James Logan. And you're right that William Penn brought him to North America as his secretary, and that on the voyage they encountered a French privateer.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, basically the Quakers, which William Penn and James Logan were supposed to be nonviolent pacifists, and that was their policy, even when they were in power in Pennsylvania until up really for the first half century of the 18th century. So when this was not uncommon on the voyage. England and France were often at war in this period when they were crossing over. At this point you're talking here, the late 17th century, to have pirate ships, privateers bearing the seal of the king, and attack these other ships. And Logan, the Quakers, William Penn and the other Quakers went below, and he went up to man the guns. And so the person who writes about this is William Franklin in his autobiography, because Franklin was someone who knew Logan, and he said that William Penn expressed some disapproval. But then I also write about, when I write about the frontier, James Logan never lived on the frontier, but he influenced it greatly, because he was the one, especially in Lancaster County, he was steering the Scotch Irish to build fortified enclaves almost in the Donegal area of Lancaster County. He was trying to keep William Penn had a policy of religious freedom, inviting immigration from Europe. So he had a lot of Germans coming over, the Mennonites, the Palatinates from a war-torn region. James Logan, William Penn, he was trying to keep control of the situation. And he was also a very learned man. He had one of the biggest libraries in colonial America, but he was also like getting his hands in the fur trade empire. And he was employing people like Anne Latour to work for him, and getting Conestoga wagons to haul the goods to warehouses he owned. So he's quite an operator, in my view. And sometimes he could be underhanded too.
Now, you can't talk about the Pennsylvania frontier without talking about someone like George Croghan. Who was he?
Yes, he was in many ways he was a rascal and a rogue. He had one of these up and down eventful lives. He came here poor from Ireland, but he basically was able to get involved in the fur trade. He had a real knack for dealing with the Native Americans. They called him Buck because he would set the prices on one deer buckskin. So one buckskin will be worth so many, maybe rifles or blankets, that sort of thing. And he was able to basically create a fur trading empire that went out way into Ohio, and he was heavily traveled. He became an important negotiator for Pennsylvania, especially in the Ohio country, which is where the great rivalry with France was developing. But he was also someone who was, getting into debt a lot. And he was actually at one point, had to flee the settled part of the province to go out. He had a post in Aldwick, which is Shirleysburg in the Juniata County area. But as much he would go out of disfavor, well, they needed him when war would break out. So when the French Indian War started, he was building forts for Pennsylvania. He later ended up working for the British had a series of commissioners for Indian tribes. And one their top person was a guy named Sir William Johnson of New York, and Croghan worked for him. He owned vast tracts of land, but he ended up dying in Philadelphia in 1782, rather broke.
Now, another key figure, somewhat similar to George Croghan, was Conrad Weiser.
Yes, he's in many ways, I find him very admirable guy. I sort of think highly of him. He was a group. He came. I mentioned before the German, and I hope I'm pronouncing this, Palatinates. They came from a region in Germany that was war torn during the 30 Years' War, and they initially settled in New York State. And the governor in that state gave them some land in the Mohawk region. But in the 1720s, Pennsylvania Governor Keith enticed a number of them to migrate down to the Reading area. And Weiser was of that group, but he came a few years later. But he had a large family, but he became the central figure for Pennsylvania in their dealings with the Iroquois, because him and the guy I mentioned before, Shikellamy, were the duo that would go up and down, be traveling on these paths, the Tuppahawken paths, sometimes in the winter, if there was a war brewing on the warriors' path between the Iroquois and the Catawba. They were the ones who would set out to go up to Onondaga to try to forge a solution. And they had many perilous accounts of these, near starvation, sometimes trying to go up through these areas in the winter. Weiser also briefly further with the Ephrata Cloister, which was a celibate communal society. So he's sort of a interesting guy in his own right. It's just not had his own, inner spiritual longings outside the practical business of being a diplomat.
Now, you mentioned the Ephrata Cloister, and you say in the book that the backcountry of Pennsylvania and Virginia attracted a good number of religious seekers and mystics in the 18th century.
That is one of the things when I first started looking at the frontier here, especially, was the influence of religion, we talked about the Moravians. We talk about the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who virtually every place that there was a spring, they built a church. And you think of Silver Spring outside of Carlisle, and you go to one of these churches today and you look and there's a spring still. So the mystics were people. Some of them were wanted to live out as hermits almost. So they would go to the far reaches away from settled life. Others were coming to the New World. The Ephrata Cloister, Comrade Beisel, the founder. These were people who, men and women lived separately, but they wanted to form a communal society, a new way of living, and they thought they could do it in the New World. And of course, Penn, in a way, had encouraged this for Pennsylvania because of religious toleration, and because inviting people, the Mennonites, the Amish, to come here. And so that's what drew him here. I write about these brothers called the Eckerlins, who they were living at Ephrata Cloister, but they had a falling out with Comrade Beisel. And one of the things was that they wanted to do more. They wanted to have operating the mill. They were somewhat more. They didn't have the same thing about lack of owning things that Beisel did. They were more practical minded in that regard, and so they were sort of had to fall out. They migrated down to Virginia. They were known as the Sabbatarians because they celebrated the Sabbath on Saturdays, and they dressed weirdly in monks' robes. The problem for these guys was that when the French Indian War broke out, they weren't trusted. The British thought they were potential French agents. The Native Americans didn't know what to make of them, and the French didn't know what to make of them either. They were taking them, two of the brothers up. They took them up to into Canada as prisoners, and eventually put them on a ship to France, where two of them died. So these kind of communal societies, they flourished in peacetime, and or even the Moravians, the Christianized villages, did well in peacetime, but in wartime, they were suspect, and so they were raided by. First of all, when the French War broke out, the Delaware, who cast their lot with the French, they distrusted the Indians who had become converts and lived in these villages. So they didn't like him. And then the English, living in Allentown and nearby Easton, not too far from some of these missions, they thought they were pro-French, and so they were getting wiped out.
Now, you mentioned the Eckerlin brothers, Israel and Samuel. They did eventually go down to Virginia at some point,
Yeah.
and then moved out into the western, I guess wouldn't have been Pennsylvania at that time, but areas along the Cheat River. They did seem to maybe wear out their welcome a little too much. At one point, George Washington was sent up to arrest them.
Yeah.
What was going on there?
This is the problem. They didn't fit. You get war, get polarized. I mean, down there, even their settlement, there's a chimney standing there too of their settlement. It's there in Massanutten Mountain, near Strasburg, Virginia. I've seen it. What's left of their settlement is this massive stone chimney. But they constantly were having to go. They were being harassed by Virginia authorities, so they were moving out to the Cheat River. This is West Virginia now. This is really on the fringe of any kind of white settlement at this period. So when the war broke out, you had a pro-French force attack them and killed some of them, and then two of the brothers were taken. Well, let's say were taken prisoner by the French up through Canada. They were not able to. Once again, they were odd ducks in a world where each side was really worried about fifth agents. There was a lot of distrust when these wars broke out.
Now, another person that you write about is Susanna Wright.
Yes.
And you mentioned that she held government posts. She looked after Native Americans who were displaced, and even counseled Benjamin Franklin and James Logan and others.
And that's interesting because the Wright family home is beautifully preserved in Columbia, Pennsylvania. And when you read about her, you read about that she had, was raising silkworms, she had orchards, and it went down to the river. We look down today and there's a railroad track going through there. But the home itself is beautifully preserved. I was intrigued by her because, here she was very literate, and she's carrying on correspondence with Franklin and his wife, and she's also had a friend named, and I'm not sure, named Samuel Blunston, who was one of the chief people who first surveyed the West Shore, what we know as the West Shore now, of Camp Hill, Lemoyne, Hampton Township, and giving lots to settlers. So she was he willed his home to her after he died. So they had a close relationship, but it's hard to know if there was something more than that. But I was intrigued by her as also a forceful woman who, especially when in the aftermath of the Conestoga massacre, she was one of the people, really concerned about that, upset by that. And so she's someone I wanted her in there because I wanted to broaden horizons of who we may think is on this frontier or involved with it, shaping it. And that's why she's in that book.
Now, you mentioned that in 1748 that there was a treaty conference in Lancaster with representatives of the Miami peoples from Pickawillinie in what is now Ohio. How did they end up coming all the way into Pennsylvania?
By around the 1740s, the British and French were starting to look at what they call the Ohio country, which really started, if you think Pittsburgh's the forks of the Ohio, they were looking at that as that was their bone. That was the ground where they were competing on. The French were coming down from the Niagara River, going down French Creek, to Pittsburgh, then into the Ohio River. George Croghan was going on with trading expeditions to the Miami seat at Pickawillinie, and Miami had actually moved out of the state of Indiana, to get away from the French influence, because they liked they thought the English had better trade goods, a better quality and better price, and so the chief Memeska had wanted to tap some of that market. So at that point, Conestoga faded. Lancaster is the really biggest inland town in the 1740s. Carlisle hadn't even been founded yet. There was no Harrisburg. And so that was becoming the place for the treaties. And so in the terms of like that world, that wasn't that long of people traveled, these Indian delegations would travel, and every maybe 200 or 300 of them, and they'd expect to be fed and housed when they got to the conference. First, it could be several weeks. So that was, James Stenton dealt with that at his house, James Logan at his house. Stenton had to entertain these delegations. So that was not unusual. Now, the problem was, so the English, had struck up a good ties with the Twi'lek or the Miami, but the French struck a counterblow in 1752. They attacked Pickawillinie and Memeska. They basically killed and boiled him and ate him. So that was his fate. And English influence in the Ohio country collapsed with the French and Indian War, because Pennsylvania really wasn't ready yet. It was a Quaker-led government, and they really weren't ready to be sending armies out to fight with the French in the Ohio region.
Now, the French continued to maintain presence, especially after the attack of Pickawillinie, in the area along the Allegheny River and the forks of the Ohio. And there was a family of the Joncaires who were influential out in that area. What role did they play?
They were the Joncaire family was the key French father and two sons who were the agents dealing with first there was the Seneca, and then what you also had was a lot of Seneca and Iroquois migrating into the Ohio region, and they became known as Mingos. So they were the key agents dealing with the Indian tribes. You had a couple French-led expeditions, military expeditions into the region to claim land, but it was really the Joncaires who were the ones who would be at the, councils in the villages, and there was these people would run into each other. The one Thomas Joncaire, one of the sons, actually there were encounters with him and George Croghan at a town called Loguestown, which is now near Ambridge, Pennsylvania. And then later on, a young George Washington was sent by the Virginia governor, because Virginia had claims in this area too, to go on a scouting mission to tell the French to get out of Western Pennsylvania. And he encountered Joncaire. This is 1753 at what was known as Fort LeBoeuf, modern day Waterford, PA, where they had a parley and they had some toast to Granny, and then sent them back on their merry way. Well, you can't come here. So these people, the Joncaires, they are running into the English representatives on these trails in these tribal areas too. So they're both out there trying to sway the tribes in the east side's favor.
Now, one of the sons, Philippe Thomas, participated in Céloron's expedition to basically, I guess, have the French lay claim to possession. But one of the things that they did was they buried lead plates.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered why. I mean, if you want people, basically, if you're saying this is ours, or stay out, why would you bury it? Why not just?
It's a good question, and they've actually found a few of them, but Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's what they were doing. Um, that was a Celadon expedition. I think it was 1749, and once again, like we are in a situation here when the English kings would grant when William Penn would get a charter for Pennsylvania, no one really knew what the western boundaries of Pennsylvania was, and they had a very um, sketchy idea. You look at some of the maps of the period of the Ohio country, even at that point, and it's really just a few of the major rivers or the forks, and the rest of it's all blank. Um, Even one of the this would be 17 maps coming out in the 1750s, English maps of the interior of Pennsylvania, New York State, and Ohio. Very, very sketchy of what was actually out there. So they lacked a good sense of geography. Now, I suppose if you're cellaring, once again, if you're going to bury your plate at the forks of the river, that's still the key spot. But what these people didn't rely, I mean, they had no, obviously the rivers courses that we look at today weren't the same as back 250 years ago because of erosion and shifting river currents. So they had no conception of that. And it is a good question why they think burying something was going to help at all. I don't know.
Now, some of the other figures out along the frontier were naturalists, people coming in,
Yes.
particularly from Europe, encountering North American plants and animals for the first time. One of them that you write about is from Sweden, is Peter Kalm.
Yes.
And you talk about how he went to Niagara Falls. What did he see there?
He was one of the Niagara Falls for hundreds of years from the first French were seeing that 1660, and it was a spectacular, one of the natural wonders of the world. And so anybody who Peter Kalm, anybody who got near it was drawn, and he writes about almost a hypnotic spell of the water, and he describes it. But he also writes too of watching the French at that time were employing the Seneca sort of porters for hauling trade goods around the falls, because you had to go on land portages, and he describes that very well. That system they had of the trade goods, the furs are coming from the deer. It's deer skin, beaver skin, and all many types of mammal skins are coming out of the Ohio country by this point, because the eastern part of the state had been overhunted, and they were taking the Fort Niagara, which is a French fort where Lake Ontario meets the Niagara River. That's why it was a choke point. It connected French Canada with the vast interior Louisiana, the vast Illinois country, Ohio country for the French, because they really were an inland colonial empire. So Kalm was one of the first, many travelers in this period were going to Niagara Falls because it was a strategic spot, because the French, by this point, the time he was there, had been, Fort Niagara was built in the 1720s. They had 20 years of French, activity in that area. And I use it because if I'm going to write about the river regions, the Niagara frontier, you can't ignore it in relation to everything else, even for Pennsylvania's frontier, because that is where warrior parties were coming to attack the Pennsylvania settlements. They were coming out of the Niagara frontier, especially during the Revolution. So it's still, people don't think of it Niagara River as being connected, but it is very much so.
Now, another figure up by the Niagara area was John Stedman, and you describe him as the master of the Niagara portage. What was his job there?
Well, he basically was the British sort of, in a way, privatized or half privatized the transportation system up there, especially after they took control of it from the French, because they had won the French Indian War. They had laid siege to Fort Little Niagara, and they took it upon themselves to modernize this transportation system. and John Stedman was from England, and then he was put in charge of it. It was quite the commercial enterprise. They had been able to the Seneca. They'd been able to win some land cessions from the Seneca right around the river on both sides of the river there. And Stedman was someone who had they had during one of the wars, Pontiac's War, when there was what I call a pan-Indian uprising against the British, about 5 years after the end of the French and Indian War, they attacked one of these convoys taking furs up in the Niagara River, and wiped them out. A place called Devil's Hole. They threw them into this. Devil's Hole was the name of a huge whirlpool in the Niagara Gorge, still there today. And they threw the Teamsters and the soldiers into the gorge. Stedman was able to, get out of it on his horseback and flee it, only by the grace of God for him. And he had another, 20 years of activity, basically on that river system, making sure that the portages were available to take goods back and forth.
Now, there were many figures from the Seneca nation that played a role in Pennsylvania. One of them was Corn Planter.
Yes, Corn Planter was, he was the son of a white trader, and he was born in central New York State, and he had a Seneca mother. And during the Revolution, Corn Planters is on many of the raids. The British, I should say, back up that during the American Revolution, the Iroquois and the Seneca had allied with the British against the Americans, the revolutionaries. And the British had, by this point, had really cultivated that relationship quite a bit. By this time, the Revolution, up in what they call the Genesee Valley, some of the Indian towns, they were living in log cabins with window panes, and their orchards and their produce, their cornfields were the envy of anybody who saw them. So as a young man, Corn Planter is influenced by that, and when the Revolution breaks out, he's leading or involved in many of the raids into northern Pennsylvania. 1778, they had something called the Great Runaway, when settlers on the West Branch of the Susquehanna were fleeing. They were being attacked. They had the Wyoming Massacre and modern-day Wilkes-Barre. After the Revolution, Corn Planter was, he had a Seneca tribe on the Allegheny region, and he was the leader. And the Americans started to cultivate him because they were, at this point, concerned that the Iroquois could ally with some of the tribes in the Ohio region. And at that point, that's where the American wars against the Indians had shifted to the Ohio region. So they were cultivating him. And also, Corn Planter was being visited by a lot of Quaker missionaries. And he came around to sort of agreeing to try to adapt white European agriculture methods, sawmill. And eventually, he was granted control of 3 land tracts by the Pennsylvania General Assembly. One was the site of, 2 he sold, one's the site now of Oil City, but Corn Planter's tract up along the border was, his descendants lived there into the 1960s. And and then what I consider one of the tragedies for the Native Americans, because they had a treaty right that it was their land. It was the Kinzo area, Seneca area, site of some of their ancestral creation myths. And when the federal government built the Kinzo Power Dam in the 60s as a basically flood control for Pittsburgh and recreational, they eventually took that land by eminent domain. And they had to relocate Corn Planter's grave, which is now in a little cemetery overlooking the reservoir. But the state of Pennsylvania paid for a monument to him to be put up there, like in 1866, at the site of this grave site for him now. So Pennsylvania never had any Indian reservations. The Indians were pushed out except for the corn planter tract, which was not really a reservation as such, but then eventually they lost that too.
Now, Corn Planter's half brother was a man named Handsome Lake,
Yes.
and you write that he was a founder of the Longhouse religion. What was that?
This was one of one of the problems of Native American society, as they were losing land, losing traditional ways, losing access to hunting. There was great social dislocation in these tribes, especially when even in Shamokin, we're talking about this polyglot town of displaced people, and so some of the traditional Native American ways of life were breaking down, and alcohol was a major problem. There was laws passed in Pennsylvania, early 18th century, not to sell liquor to Indians, but they weren't. Obviously, they were ignored. So by the time we were here in the late 18th century, there was a movement in many tribes to go back to the traditional religions, to not to give up alcohol, to not get to try to not embrace Christianity. And Handsome Lake was one of the more prominent advocates of that. And so half brother of Corn Planter. So that, but there's also tension, because Corn Planter, between the two, it wasn't like, as he was trying to navigate this new world, you had Handsome Lake also advocating a different course. And even in, there were similar, on the Ohio frontier at this time, there was a guy named the Prophet emerging among the Shawnee, advocating the return of traditional religious values. So it was not just the Seneca, this was happening in other tribes too.
Now, another Seneca man who had a great influence was Red Jacket, and you say that he eventually became a celebrity as a result of some paintings by people like George Catlin. How did that happen?
He was has his name Red Jacket. He was once again born in New York State. He has his name Red Jacket because a British officer gave him a red jacket to wear in the Revolution. He was in some battles, but he was more of an orator. And he said he was widely. Some of his speeches have been reprinted once again by white men, but they're classic speeches. He was considered a powerful orator, and he basically, his lot in life was, by the early 19th century, the Seneca they were trying to avoid being sent to Kansas, basically, which is where a lot of the Delaware of Pennsylvania ended up in Oklahoma by around the early mid 19th century. And Corn Planter, or Red Jacket, was trying to stop that. So he was fighting what I call a rearguard action. What they managed to do, they lost a lot of the land west of the Genesee River that they had, but they saved what were reservations. They lost a key one which became the city of Buffalo, but there's about 5 or 6 reservations to this day, Tonawanda, Cattaraugus, where the Senecas still live in, and so Red Jackets is someone, and he was controversial with the Seneca, but they sort of have to, I think he has a big role in achieving that. The Seneca were able to negotiate a treaty with the United States government in 1794, which sort of recognized them as a nation. And once again, they had a disastrous treaty that would have forced them up, but that got, with the help of Red Jacket and some others and some white people, they got that renegotiated. So Red Jacket, another thing that he's known for, he actually met George Washington. Washington gave him this big silver medal, which I've seen this on display. And so he would wear that. And he lived long enough that I include Millard Fillmore, who was president of the United States from Buffalo. I actually met him when he was a young man and wrote a description of him. I thought that was fascinating. So, because Millard Fillmore is not someone you always think of, meeting Red Jacket. So I included his description in my story. This is late at life. Red Jacket now has a nice Buffalo's major cemeteries, Forest Lawn, and you go in there and there's a great monument to Red Jacket with some other Seneca chiefs buried around him.
Well, that'll have to be the last word. We're out of time. We have been speaking with Robert Swift. He is the author of the book By Great Rivers, Lives on the Appalachian Frontier. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for the opportunity.
To find more PA Books episodes and other programs produced by the Pennsylvania Cable Network, visit pcntv.com or download the PCN app. I'm Phil Beckman. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit pcntv.com or the App Store for details.